Representative Sampson of the 80th, you have the floor, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Hello.
I just want to start by stating that I've been enjoying the conversation about the bill before us, and I think it's delightful that we are addressing a concern that we have in our state law regarding the supremacy of the federal government when it comes to immigration. I wholly support the bill before us, well actually the amended bill before us, and I am hopeful that it passes. But I also believe this gives us an opportunity to address a glaring problem in our state law on the subject of immigration. And I'd like to do that, Mr. Speaker, by offering an amendment. The clerk has an amendment. It is LCO 3749. Mr. Speaker?
The clerk may have an amendment, but I do not. So the House will stand at ease momentarily. The House, please come back to session. Representative Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, you should have an amendment before you, and the clerk should have it. It's LCO 3749. I would like to have it called and have the opportunity to summarize.
Thank you, Representative Sampson. Will the clerk please call LCO 3749, which shall be designated House Amendment Schedule B.
House Amendment Schedule B, LCO number 3749, offered by Representative Sampson, Representative Dubitsky.
Representative Sampson has asked permission from the chamber to summarize without objection. Please proceed, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The amendment before us is in addition to the underlying bill. I want to make it clear that I support the underlying legislation. It does the right thing, which I like to see in this chamber, by making changes to our state law to conform with federal law, which we all know has supremacy when it comes to the arena of immigration law. My amendment simply removes language from our current law that is in violation and direct opposition to federal law. It eliminates what's commonly known as the Trust Act from our state law, and that is simply added as a last section to the underlying bill, which I also support.
Thank you, Representative Sampson. Representative Ritter of the first, for what purpose do you rise, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that we pass this item temporarily.
Without objection, so ordered.
Will the clerk please call calendar number 36 as amended by House A?
On page 46, Substitute House Bill number 5185, as amended by House A, an act concerning guardianship appointments for individuals seeking special immigrant juvenile status. Favorable report of the Joint Standing Committee on Judiciary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk. The chamber may remember we took out this bill earlier in the day. It has been amended. The amendment was accepted, and now it's coming back to be explained and voted on. Thank you very much. Representative Urban, thank you for waiting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of the bill.
The question is acceptance of the Joint Committee's favorable report and passage of the bill. Representative Urban, you have the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that I have given significant testimony on why this bill should become law, so I would urge adoption through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Representative. Will you remark further on the bill as amended? Will you remark further on the bill as amended? Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to start from the outset by saying that I support the underlying bill very much. I was listening to the debate earlier, and I appreciated the number of times it was mentioned and brought to the attention of the chamber that we need to be in alignment with federal law when it comes to correcting this area of our state law as it pertains to immigration. And it occurred to me that there is a glaring problem in our state law when it comes to immigration. It's something called the Trust Act. I want to speak about it in more detail, but I will start, Mr. Speaker, by offering an amendment. The clerk should have an amendment that is LCO 3749. Would you please ask the clerk to call it and allow me to summarize?
Thank you, sir. Will the clerk please call LCO 3749, which will be designated House Amendment Schedule B?
House Amendment Schedule B, LCO number 3749, offered by Representative Sampson and Representative Dubitsky.
Thank you very much. The representative seeks leave of the chamber to summarize the amendment. Is there objection to summarization? Is there objection? Hearing none. Representative Sampson, you may proceed with summarization.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The amendment that is before us is a very simple amendment. It is in addition to the underlying bill. I want to make that very, very clear that this is not a strike-all amendment. I agree with the underlying bill. I support the underlying bill. I want to see the underlying bill become law. My amendment adds language to that existing, currently amended bill before us to simply remove from our current state law something commonly known as the Trust Act, which essentially is a set of provisions that tells our local and state law enforcement officials to ignore criminal warrants issued by ICE under the authority of the federal government. And I move adoption, Mr. Speaker.
The question before the chamber is adoption of House Amendment Schedule B. Will you remark on the amendment? Representative Urban, I'm sorry, Representative Urban, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It took a while for my mic to come on. I'm very sorry. Mr. Speaker, I totally appreciate the good representative's support of the underlying bill, and I respect that he is bringing out this amendment. But, Mr. Speaker, the underlying bill is for a very narrow portion of our law. It applies to juveniles between the ages of 18 and 21, and it then, applies to federal law after a probate court has looked at those juveniles. And in addition, the underlying bill is civil law. The amendment is looking at criminal law. And we have not had a public hearing on this particular issue, which is a very important issue, and I believe should have a public hearing. So I would urge my colleagues to not pass this and wait for another time. And, Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a roll call vote.
Question before the chamber is on a roll call. The question before the chamber is on a roll call vote. Let me try your minds. All those in favor of roll call signify by saying aye. Aye. The requisite 20% has been met. Will you remark further? Will you remark further on the amended bill? The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. No. Wait a second. Mr. Sampson, I cut you off before, and I am cutting you off again. I apologize, Representative. You, sir, have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just for the record, I believe we have simply affirmed that we will have a roll call vote when the amendment is voted upon. And I will also state for the record that this language did in fact have a public hearing. This bill was brought before the Judiciary Committee, and it did in fact have a public hearing. So that is incorrect. I believe that this amendment is directly related to the underlying bill because they have to do with the same thing, which is the issue of supremacy when it comes to immigration law. Our United States Constitution is very clear that the area of immigration law is the purview of the federal government, that we do not have the right to interfere with that. And we are simply, in the underlying bill, making a correction to comply with federal law. And I think that's notable because it seems like we are willing to, as a body, come together to make changes to our state law to comply with federal law when it suits us, and in other cases, ignore federal law when it does not. And my amendment speaks directly to that because we have a provision in our state law which is an absolute, utter, and direct contradiction to federal law. It is called the Trust Act. And essentially what it does is it says to our local and state law enforcement officials across our state that they must ignore the federal requirement that they have, the federal law that tells them what their actions should be when dealing with criminal illegal aliens. I want to stop right there, and I want to just talk about a little vocabulary, because whenever the issue of immigration comes up, the issue of vocabulary needs to come up too. Because as someone who believes in the rule of law in our country, as someone who is descendant from people who immigrated from other countries, I care about the rule of law, and I care about the value of America's heritage as a home for immigration. The thing is that it always seems that when you start talking about illegal immigration, people that want to support policies that benefit illegal immigration always omit the word illegal. There is nobody in this room, there's probably nobody in this building who is against immigration. We all have friends, neighbors, family members, and ancestors that are immigrants. It's nonsense to suggest that someone's against immigration because they believe in a law that sets up a process for how people immigrate to our country. And I'll go one step further. When it comes to the issue of the Trust Act, it's not even about immigration or illegal immigration, it's about criminal illegal immigration. There are people that come to this country legally every day, and I support them, and I want to see the federal government actually tackle that issue more properly than they have in recent years. And I want them to do that by understanding the number of people that want to enter our country and the value that they can provide to our culture and our economy. But that's very difficult to do when we are dealing with the larger issue of illegal immigration. And it's even harder to do when we're dealing with the other issue, which is the small but significant number of people who are in the country illegally that also happen to be criminals. Now, I'm going to say one more time, this bill is about criminal illegal aliens. It's not about immigration. It's not even about illegal immigration. It's about criminals who happen to be illegal aliens. We passed this law several years ago, in fact, when I first got here, and it may have passed unanimously, and I voted for it. And I voted for it because I was told that the Trust Act was a good bill, because what it did was it gave a mechanism for people who are in our cities across our state but who are in the country illegally a way to confront law enforcement without fear of being deported. That they could trust their local law enforcement agent to say, look, my neighbor's a criminal. I want to tell you, but you can't deport me. That's just one of the many, many fallacies that have been perpetrated on us when the Trust Act was passed. And I'm going to go through them very, very briefly. I don't intend to spend a lot of time on this issue, but I want the record straight. And I believe it's important that we have an up or down vote in this body to say who supports the rule of law, who supports the fact that the federal government determines what our immigration laws, and who does not. The issue is that if you believe the folks that push the Trust Act, you believe that illegal aliens are more inclined to come to law enforcement because it exists. But there is no proof that anyone has ever been deported because they reported a crime to law enforcement as someone in the country illegally. There is not a single example of that anywhere. And think about it, why would they? If I'm a local law enforcement officer and some illegal alien comes to me and reports a crime to me, my first reaction is not going to be to bite the hand that feeds me and say, hey, incidentally, how are you here? That's not what they're going to do. They're going to appreciate that fact, and they are going to be less inclined to prosecute them based on that. And in fact, I would say they are arguably less likely to ask. Aside from which, there is nothing stopping any of us or someone in the country illegally from reporting a crime anonymously. Every day, crimes are reported anonymously. There are tip lines galore. There is nothing stopping anyone from reporting a crime if that is their desire. You don't need to create an impediment to federal law to make that happen. These policies, these sanctuary policies, and let me just clarify that really quick too. The Trust Act, in effect, makes Connecticut a sanctuary state by saying that our local law enforcement officials, our state law enforcement officials cannot interfere, or actually instead interfere, but not assist in apprehending or detaining people that are under a criminal warrant from the federal government. The thing is that the only people that can actually offer something to someone who's in the country illegally who wants to report a crime is the federal government. Our state authorities have no authority to do so. They cannot change someone's status or extend their visa or give them a special accommodation in any way. There is actually no benefit whatsoever for someone to report a crime as an illegal alien to their local or state officials. However, if they report it to their federal official, there are programs in place just for that purpose. Now, I'm not an expert at this, and I honestly didn't know I was going to be having this conversation today, so I did not do near the preparation that I normally would. But there are multiple visa statuses that allow people to stay in the country for various purposes. They are known as the STU and the VWAWA non-immigrant visas, which basically are tools at the disposal of federal law enforcement officials for granting additional status for immigration to people in the country illegally when they help them apprehend criminals. Why? Why on earth would we be standing in the way of actually helping someone get additional status by saying, we don't want you talking to the person who can give it to you? That's ridiculous. Illegal aliens are not going to cooperate with law enforcement in sanctuary cities. Many people that come to this country illegally come from places that have corrupt governments. There is not the incentive there that's going to convince them that they're suddenly going to be trusting American police. And add that to the fact that we are actually telling people in our community that we only care about some of our laws. These laws over here, we're going to follow those. But these laws over here, well, they don't mean so much, so let's ignore them. How can we do that and then expect that someone's new to our country who wants to trust in the authorities is going to do so? I wouldn't trust anyone who tells me I follow the law on Monday and Tuesday, but Wednesday it's out the window. It erodes the civic trust. It also makes a mockery of what we do here. Everyone in this room is a lawmaker. We work hard to come up with policies, public policy that affect how our state runs. And I'm sure that the people in the federal government do that also, and our town governments across the state. They do that in good faith, expecting that what they come up with, because they have the authority in our documents that determine how our country is run, to do so. It's not up to us to decide that someone else's authority doesn't matter. The other thing is that the notion that somehow these sanctuary policies increase the safety of people that are in the country illegally is complete and utter nonsense. When you set up a sanctuary state or a sanctuary city, what you're doing essentially is you are telling the criminal element among the very decent, honest, hardworking illegal alien population that they should come into their neighborhood because they're less likely to be apprehended. That doesn't sound like a good plan either. I'm going to close just by saying that I want to speak to people that are illegal aliens that are living in our state currently. I just want to explain to you that if you are a decent, law-abiding person in every other respect, this bill is not about you. I got no interest in dealing with that. As I stated from the beginning, not my job. Federal government handles immigration, not the state government. But we have a state law that does affect you. And basically what it says is that for people that are subject to a criminal ICE warrant, which is not you. That is not you. There are people here in the country illegally that are not on the list of people that the federal government is trying to detain. Generally speaking, you end up on the federal ICE warrant list because you are a significant threat to the community. You are a criminal. You're suspected of terrorism. I'll just make a side note that our policies, like the Trust Act, lead to terrorism because they don't do what's necessary to make sure that we are protecting our fellow citizens against people that are coming into this country to do us harm. What I want to say to you folks is, if you are aware of a criminal, don't contact your local law enforcement officials. Call the federal government. Call ICE. Call them and tell them you're aware of criminal activity. They are the ones that can actually help you. Forgive me, I have several notes scattered across several things.
Take your time, Representative.
I guess I've covered pretty much all of the points. We could talk at some length about the cost to our society for the failure to follow our federal immigration laws. We could talk about the threat to public safety. We could talk about how they put national security at risk. And we could talk about how these policies are ultimately extremely discriminatory and extremely unfair to people that enter the country through the legal process. I stand before you, Mr. Speaker, simply to ask that the members of this body vote to stop ignoring our obligation, our constitutional oath to uphold the Constitution, to uphold what our obligations are to the federal government, to recognize the supremacy of the federal law on immigration, and to stop making it easier for criminals to hide in our state because they are less likely to be apprehended, because we are instructing our law enforcement not to help assist in apprehending them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative. Will you remark further on the amendment? Will you remark further on the amendment? Representative Tong, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in very strong opposition to this amendment. And I want to take some of what has been said piece by piece. I rise largely because I feel, as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, a duty and obligation to correct the record and to make sure that everyone in this chamber understands what the Trust Act does and what it does not do, and the process of how we've considered changes to the Trust Act. As many of you know, I stood on the floor of this House 2 or 3 weeks ago and implored this body to respect the rule of law, to uphold our state's Constitution, to know our role constitutionally. And I agree with Representative Sampson when he says that immigration law is the purview of the federal government. Not our job, is what Representative Sampson said, and that it is the obligation of the federal government to enforce our immigration laws. That is exactly why this chamber passed the Trust Act unanimously, 132 to 0. As Representative Sampson indicated, he himself voted for that law. And what that law says is exactly what Representative Sampson said earlier. The Trust Act says that the federal government will retain its authority for enforcing immigration law, and it's not the obligation of state and local law enforcement to do their jobs for them. That is why unanimously we passed that law. Now, Representative Sampson mentioned criminals. He used that word over and over again, Mr. Speaker. He used the word illegal over and over again. He talked about criminals and I presume bad hombres and people that would do us harm. That's addressed in the Trust Act and the language that this amendment seeks to remove. In fact, it has several exceptions in the Trust Act which provide that state and local law enforcement will not cooperate with a civil immigration detainer and will not do the federal government's job for them unless the person is a criminal. And so the Trust Act carves out several exceptions. For example, if somebody has been convicted of a felony, if somebody is subject to pending criminal charges, if someone is an identified gang member, if someone is identified as a possible match on the federal terrorist screening database, if this person presents an unacceptable risk to public safety, that is in the Trust Act. That is in our statutes. That is the law of this state, of this land today, and 132 of us voted for it. And so to pass this amendment today, I posit, would make us even less safe, because this provides the circumstances under which we are to cooperate or not with federal immigration authorities. So I wanted to correct that record, that indeed the issue about people who have committed crimes is addressed in the Trust Act, and that's existing law. I will say, Mr. Speaker, that I take some exception to the reference to our American heritage. I'm not sure exactly what was meant by that. Let me tell you what I know about our American heritage. I know about the Huang family in Farmington who came here 20 years ago. They opened a nail salon in Simsbury. They worked 7 days a week, killed themselves every day for their two boys, Americans, both of them. And they faced the possible threat of deportation back to China. They're ethnic Koreans, so there was a possibility that they would be deported to North Korea. And all the Huangs have ever done was work extremely hard and contribute to the communities of Farmington and Simsbury. Let me tell you about the Altaff family of New Britain, who opened a pizza place, who also work around the clock for their family and their children. That is part of our American heritage. And let me tell you about Addie Tong, my father, who was working in his Chinese restaurant on Park Street in Hartford when an INS agent walked in almost 50 years ago. My father, yes, had overstayed his tourist visa. And that INS agent said, "You got to get out, or we're going to throw you out." And in desperation, my father wrote a 6-page handwritten letter to the President of the United States, President Richard Nixon, a Republican president who responded to my father's plea. And President Nixon responded and sent that same INS agent back to our restaurant and said, "Mr. Tong, you can stay. You have to go to the back of the line and wait your turn." And because of that, I was the first American born in my family. And he became a citizen many years later. People like the Altefs, people like the Huangs, people like Miriam Martinez in Stanford, people like the Tongs work every day, 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. They contribute to this economy. They do great things for our community. That is the American heritage that I think we all know and love. And this bill is an affront. This amendment is an affront to that heritage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative. Will you remark further on House Amendment B? Representative Lamar, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong objection to the amendment that's being offered. Mr. Speaker, the insinuation was made that this will make our community safer. By adopting the amendment before us, Connecticut will become a safer place for our residents, for our citizens. Well, let me tell you how wrong that is. We don't need to trust Representative Sampson's words about what will make us safer. We can instead listen to police chiefs, our chief state's public attorney, our chief public defenders, and every law enforcement official who supported the establishment of these principles when they were enacted into law in 2013. Every one of them came before us and said the procedures we put in place at that time will make Connecticut citizens safer. I represent two communities in this General Assembly, the city of New Haven and the town of East Haven. In New Haven, we are proud to have a working relationship between our New Haven Police Department and every community group in our city that knows that if they are a victim of or witness to a crime, they can safely come forward, report what they've seen, and protect all of our citizens with the information that they have. The police department in New Haven has stated numerous occasions that the protections we have in place saves lives. Moving backwards, as this amendment seeks to do, places all of our citizens in Connecticut at risk. The established procedures we have in place are worth protecting. They're worth protecting strongly. They're worth rewarding everyone who's come forward and said, all of our residents deserve the ability to come forward, go to the local police department, report crimes, be witness to crimes, and ensure our communities are safer. I also represent the town of East Haven. Now, a few years back, that town had some rogue police officers who were harassing and profiling individuals as they came into town. The Federal Department of Justice came in, investigated what was going on, saw the amount of terror that these few rogue police officers were creating in that community. And the Federal Department of Justice offered the solution that we have in Connecticut to restore trust in all of their communities. The police department enacted processes and procedures very similar to that which we have established in Connecticut state law. Because we know all citizens, all residents, all people who call Connecticut home should come forward if they're a witness to a crime. They should come forward if they're a victim of a crime. They should have a working relationship with their police departments, and they should ensure that all of our communities are safe and feel welcome being part of the American process. Now, we've seen in the last year attacks on immigration. We've seen attacks for political purposes in buildings outside of Connecticut. I don't know that I've seen the language and the verbiage that was used today anywhere in Connecticut until this last moment. So I'm fearful that we've entered into this national conversation in the most disparaging way, in a way that would step back from our unanimous vote, our unanimous public policy support of civil immigration detainer procedures that we established. And it is my hope that we can listen to the words of New Haven police chiefs, the Connecticut Association of Police Chiefs, the Connecticut Criminal Defense Association, the chief public defenders, the chief state's attorneys, and all those who've come forward suggesting that Connecticut's procedures are the right policy for the state of Connecticut. Please vote against this amendment.
Thank you very much, Representative. Will you remark further on Amendment B? Will you remark further on Amendment B? Representative Candelara of the 86th District, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand in support of this amendment. I understand the concerns that were just raised by the other side of the aisle, but this amendment in particular refers to illegal immigrants who have been detained under a civil detainer. And I think under current law, under the law that we did pass unanimously, one of the provisions has us notifying the federal authorities when an illegal immigrant has been arrested and committed a crime, and allows for a release within 48 hours. And what I continue to hear from our communities, and we could get, reserved for another day, the other issue of our good time credits and the impact on our communities, but that releasing these criminals back into society has caused a problem in our communities. And we're hearing about neighborhood groups forming together, trying to seek ways of making their neighborhoods safer. And frankly, I think it's this policy in part that has led to our cities to being less safe. Because if an individual has committed a crime and is under civil detainer, they should be retained by our law enforcement until we hear from the federal government on how we should handle them. Under the current Trust Act provisions, they're released within 48 hours. And I think that that underlying bill, while I did support it many years ago, has gone too far in its application, has made Connecticut residents less safe. Therefore, I support the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative. Will you remark further on Amendment B? Will you remark further on Amendment B? If not, Representative Smith, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a question, I guess, through you to the proponent of the amendment, if I may.
Yes, Representative. Representative Sampson, please prepare yourself for a question. Thank you. Representative Smith, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just for clarification purposes, when we talk about a civil detainer, what are we actually referring to through you, Mr. Speaker?
Thank you. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A civil detainer is essentially a warrant that is issued by the federal government to apprehend someone who is in the country illegally, and typically because they have committed a criminal act. I was very clear when I spoke that this bill is not about immigration. It's not even about illegal immigration. It is about criminal illegal immigrants. That's the subject of the bill. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Smith?
And I thank the proponent for that clarification, because when you hear the word civil detainer, you think a civil action or a civil proceeding or a civil matter, when in fact what we're talking about is a criminal matter that's before the federal government. And I notice in our current detainer statute that it talks about if there's been a prior conviction of a felony, obviously there could be very serious Class A misdemeanors that we have on our books. That person could have been convicted of a Class A misdemeanor, a sexual assault, anything along those lines, yet under our current statute would not be able to be retained by our current and local police. So I think we have gone too far in the detainer statute. I think this amendment helps clear it up and gives our local police authorities a little bit more jurisdiction and power to actually, as the good judiciary from the chairman from the Judiciary Committee said, to get those bad hombres off the streets and where they belong. So I'll support the bill as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Will you remark further? Representative O'Neill of the 69th, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I could, through you, a question to the proponent of the amendment.
Please be prepared. Yes, Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. In bringing out the amendment, it was indicated that our current law, the so-called Trust Act, is in conflict with federal law. And I have read, and I just pulled up a copy of the article that was published in October of last year, in which the Attorney General said that Connecticut's Trust Act does not violate federal law. Now, it seemed to be directed at information sharing kinds of aspects, but apparently the Attorney General issued a press release stating that Connecticut and some other jurisdictions were not in violation of federal law. Apparently there had been an earlier press release that had suggested that maybe we were. And then this was a clarification. So my question is, has there been a determination by a federal authority, or for that matter a state authority, a judge or police organization, law enforcement organization, that Connecticut's Trust Act is in violation of federal law? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question. I am not aware of any court case that might stipulate whether or not the Trust Act has been found to be with or without credibility in our federal requirement. But we have our U.S. Constitution, we have our federal law that establishes that immigration is the purview of the federal government. And any provision that we would put in our state law that creates an impediment, a direct impediment to the federal government in being able to prosecute federal law, clearly is a violation.
Thank you, Representative Sampson. Representative O'Neill, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Then I guess I have to ask, what is the clear impediment that Connecticut law presents to the federal government in the enforcement of the U.S. immigration laws? What provision of this of the Trust Act creates that impediment? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative O'Neill. Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. Essentially, our Trust Act directs state and local law enforcement officials to ignore federal law when they are required to obey it in detaining people that are subject of a federal warrant. Can you imagine anyone saying that we are not going to detain someone that is subject to a federal warrant for anything else? Sorry for asking a question with a question, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative O'Neill, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, as I read the Trust Act, and I did read it rather quickly in connection with all of this, it talks about civil detainers, and that's what the conversation was earlier. Is there language in our law that specifically says that police officers or other law enforcement people are to ignore, not pay attention to a federal warrant? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative O'Neill, for your question. Representative Sampson, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes. The statement in our existing law is no law enforcement officer who receives a civil immigration detainer with respect to an individual who is in the custody of the law enforcement officer shall detain such individual pursuant to such civil immigration detainer, and so on. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Okay, because that's different, the language about detainers, that's a different instrument from a federal warrant. And so when I read through it, I didn't see the word warrant referenced anywhere in our law on that score. So I thank the gentleman for his clarification. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative O'Neill. Will you remark further? Representative Candelaria of the 95th District. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A couple of questions through you, Mr. Speaker, to the proponent of the amendment.
Yes, Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm just want to get a little bit more clarification. When we're talking about within the proposed amendment, and we specifically talk about civil immigration detainer, and I've been hearing that this detainer is also a warrant. To my understanding, it's not a warrant, so I just would like a little bit more clarification through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Sampson, if you would, please prepare yourself for questions. Representative Candelaria, please proceed. Yes. Oh.
Already asked.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Candelaria, would you please repeat your question for
Sure.
Representative Sampson?
So within the proposed amendment, it talks specifically about civil immigration detainer. And I've been hearing the debate a little bit, and I'm quite confused because to my understanding, the detainer is not a warrant. So I would like some clarification because it specifically talks pursuant to, I'm assuming this is a federal section, ACFR 287.7. So I want some clarification specific to that section. What does it entail? Because my assumption that this is basically a notice of ICE to our local authorities for someone that we do have in custody, so that they can start that proceeding to have that individual removed from the country. So we're talking about proceedings. So I'm quite confused when I hear the word warrant. So I would like some more clarification on that. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. Let me just say that I don't claim to be an expert on the federal law regarding federal warrants or civil detainers, but I do have some information in front of me, and I want to make it clear what we're talking about. We're talking about people that are already in the country illegally that are also subject to a request from ICE that is determined to be what's called a civil detainer. And my understanding of the law is that the only people that are subject to those detainers are people identified under the DACS system, DACS, which is the Deportable Alien Control System. And generally speaking, you end up on that list because you have been charged under a section of the Immigration and Nationality Act that requires a criminal conviction and the charge is the basis for the removal, or two, a criminal conviction noted in the DACA system for a crime that renders the alien removable. And that is not simply being here illegally. So I keep going back to this. We can talk about the ins and outs of it, but the Trust Act is about telling our law enforcement officials not to comply with their obligations to federal law. It was mentioned that they should only follow state law. Well, I don't know about you or anyone else here, but I am subject to federal law and state law. I cannot not file my taxes because I did file my state taxes. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Candelaria.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. I'm still confused, so I still would like more clarification on it. Because when we bring this proposal out, there's a couple of things that come to mind. You know, we're talking about people that have been convicted of a felony or who are in the process. So I want more clarification on that. And here's my other concern. You know, people that may be detained, now I think we're crossing the border because we're talking about profiling at the same time. So I'm a little bit concerned about that piece. And the issue of people having similar names. So I want to make sure that if this does go through and we are actually going to start moving within this process, how will we identify that these are the right individuals that are in custody, not people that have similar names? Because if they're going to look at a database based on names, damn, sorry about that, but Juan Candelaria probably will be in that list because there's many Candelarias throughout the nation. So I am concerned. How do we identify that the person that we have in front of us, that this bill tends to have our local law enforcement that, and I may add, that where they could be focusing their energies on more serious crime will be focusing more acting as ICE agents. How will we ensure that those people are the correct people, first of all, and what would be that process? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Sampson, that question is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were a number of pieces to that question. The first one I would say is we are only talking about actual criminals. That's the first thing that I want to just reiterate. That DAX system determines who among our immigrant population that is in the country illegally, who among that larger group falls into the category of being eligible for criminal removal. And by definition, those are criminals. Those are people that have committed a crime either under our immigration laws or because they've committed a much more serious crime. But it is not simply their presence in the country illegally. I don't know what the latest estimates are for the number of people that are in the U.S. illegally. I hear different numbers, 10 million, 11 million, 12 million, who knows. 3 million people approximately are identified in the DAX system as criminal aliens, but only 1 million of them, so we're talking 10% of the population, have final orders of removal. And the scary part, ladies and gentlemen, that everyone should be aware of is that ICE only at any one time is able to apprehend 1% of them, about 11,000. So there are many, many people who are here illegally that are also criminals, and not everyone here illegally I would classify as a criminal. We're only talking about criminals. Are in our communities, making everyone less safe, citizens and non-citizens alike. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Representative Candelara, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, here's where my concern is, because if we're talking about criminals, if you break the law, you're a criminal, right? So you have a lot of, unfortunately, people that left their country for a better life here in the U.S. who crossed our borders. Based on what I'm hearing, they'll be considered criminals. So who are we? We're looking at everyone then. That becomes the bigger concern. But here's the biggest question for me. We know that we have had people that have been detained by our system. They're currently in custody. And they're still in custody because ICE has not come and get them. There is a cost associated with that. If we pass this bill, I would assume that we will see more proactive we'll see our police force more proactively targeting these individuals, getting them into custody, and there will be a cost associated with that. Because for a fact I know, and that even in our correctional system, we have people that have been there for years with detention orders, and they're still within our prison, and Connecticut taxpayers are paying for that. This will add additional burden to our taxpayers. So I don't think this would be the right bill to move forward at this particular time. One, for that reason, we're talking about that we have a fiscal crisis that we need to address. Secondly, when we're talking about who are we going after, it could be anyone that has crossed the borders illegally. A family that's here looking for a better life. A family that's probably working at a restaurant that we go eat every day, right, where we go socialize with our families. Those are the individuals who are doing a lot of the work here in the United States. So I have many concerns with this bill. I encourage my colleagues not to support it and reject the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Srinivasan of the 31st District, please, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I too have been listening to this debate intently and want to make sure that I have some things clarified in my mind before we obviously press the right button. So through you to the proponent of the amendment, a few questions through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. And sitting behind you, we have the proponent of the amendment, Representative Sampson. If you would, sir, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to position myself so I can hear my good representative's answers. Through you, Mr. Speaker, it is my understanding and is loud and clear that on numerous occasions Representative Sampson alluded that this is only going to impact criminals who are obviously illegal immigrants as well, but only if they have committed a crime. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that question from my colleague. Yes, I will reiterate that this applies only to those people that are being pursued by federal law enforcement authorities, and that does not apply to every person who is in the country legally. I have the statistics here. I'd be happy to review them with anyone who would like to discuss them.
Thank you very much.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I want to
Yes.
thank the good representative for the response, because that was an important clarification. Because in the previous conversations that we had, our good chair of the Judiciary Committee gave a long list of individuals, hardworking. He talked about them working 7 days a week, 15 hours a day, and also shared his own family story. But through you, Mr. Speaker, since all of those individuals, I'm presuming they are not criminals, through you, Mr. Speaker, would this amendment impact them anyway? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Again, this amendment simply strikes something that is in our state law that is in direct contradiction to federal law. It is a law that we passed and adopted that says that we are going to tell our local, state, and local law enforcement officials to not comply with federal law, which they have to because federal law has supremacy in the area of immigration. My amendment is simply to strike that. It is not, as was suggested, to target anyone. In fact, we don't do anything in this case except for comply with the federal law that already exists and remove our provisions from state law that would be an impediment to our obligations to comply with federal law.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, being not an attorney, I just want to clear that. As I understand this amendment, if this amendment were not to pass, through you, Mr. Speaker, within a 48-hour period of retaining, if ICE were not able to get to them, of course excluding holidays and weekends and so on and so forth, those individuals who are criminals in our society would have to be released. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Back to you, Representative Sampson, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And please forgive me that I didn't really understand the question. I don't think that there is anything that is in our current state law that directs us to do anything except for to comply with the federal law that exists. So I don't know if I can really answer that question with respect to this amendment. This amendment simply removes what I feel and I think can be clearly demonstrated is in direct contradiction to existing federal law. And if went to a court, I think it would say so.
Thank you, Representative Sampson.
And through you, Mr.
Representative Srinivasan, your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And through you, my final question to the good proponent of the amendment. So what this basically does is that if we detain such individuals, as I see that in lines 61 through 63, those individuals will continue to be detained till the immigration authorities, come over and take charge of the situation. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Representative Srinivasan. Representative Sampson, Representative Srinivasan has said this is his final question. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would be delighted to reply that that is correct. And as is the case in every other state that does not establish its own unconstitutional impediment to following federal law. Simply, the amendment removes an impediment that should not be there. We have no right to be interfering with the federal authorities on this issue.
Thank you, Representative Sampson. Representative Srinivasan, of course you may ask all the questions you wish. I hope I wasn't discouraging you.
Not at all.
You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, I have asked all my questions. Thank you for the opportunity to do so. But I do want to also close by saying, being a first-generation immigrant myself, having gone through the process, a due process, for me to come here into this nation, this beautiful nation, and have all the opportunities that I have had the opportunity that I was able to bring my wife here when we got married, and gone through the process, through the legal process that enables us to be legal citizens here. And so for us now to look at the illegal citizens, illegal immigrants that have come into this country, and then, unfortunately, these criminal acts that are done by these individuals, they've got to be held responsible. And then for us to say that, gee, you know what, they are criminals, yes, they happen to be illegal, yes, and we do not need to do anything about that. Turn and look the other way will definitely not make our societies safer. We need to make sure our first responsibility is public safety. And for public safety, we need to make sure these illegal immigrants who are criminals, they need to be held under the federal authorities for due action to be taken to them. I stand here, Mr. Speaker, in strong support of the amendment, and I hope my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, will do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Still on House Amendment B. Representative Staffstrom, please, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through you, a couple of questions to the proponent of the amendment.
Of course. I believe the proponent of the amendment is just waiting for his microphone to go live.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the proponent of the amendment has said repeatedly that this amendment does not affect everyone who is in the country illegally. It would only apply to those who have committed otherwise criminal conduct. Is that correct through you, Mr. Speaker?
Thank you. Representative Sampson?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I have stated is that they are required only to detain those people that the federal government has issued a civil detainer for, and I specified the reasons why a civil detainer would be issued, which includes criminal conduct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, sir. Representative Staffstrom.
So, Mr. Speaker, through you, is the answer to my previous question no?
Thank you, Representative Staffstrom. Representative, I'm sorry, Representative Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The thing is that I don't know what the federal law is in great detail. I do not know what things determine what is would require a civil detainer would be issued. But we're talking about two different things here. The issue is public policy that is developed on a federal level versus state level. And the amendment simply says we have no right to interfere on something that is their jurisdiction and removes it. I don't know why we're debating what is a crime under federal law or not. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Representative. Representative, your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through you, I think that kind of highlights the problem with the amendment. The proponent doesn't, in fact, and can't, in fact, tell us exactly what it does or doesn't do. I think, I still would like some clarity, because it's been said a couple times here, that this amendment, these detainer holds would only apply to those who have committed criminal conduct outside of otherwise being in this country without documentation. So I'm trying to just clarify, does the proponent know, yes or no, whether in fact this bill applies to folks who are in the country, this amendment applies to folks who are in the country without documentation who have not otherwise committed criminal conduct? Through you.
Thank you. We're back to the 80th District. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The answer is absolutely no. Thank you.
Representative Staffstrom.
Absolutely no. The proponent does not know whether it applies to folks who are in the country illegally and who have not committed criminal conduct, or only to those who have committed otherwise criminal conduct. Through you.
Good thing you stayed standing, Representative Sampson. It's your turn again.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I actually like the notion of answering questions on this side of the room and look forward to doing a lot more of it in the future. I said no, the amendment would not apply to anyone that has not committed criminal conduct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative Sampson. Now we go back to the 129th District. Representative, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through you, what line of the amendment can I find that assurance at? Through you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Sampson, do you need a moment to look through the amendment? Thank you. You're ready. As you wish, please.
There is nothing in the amendment that pertains to federal law. Again, we are in the state legislature. The federal government has the purview of immigration. If they determine that someone needs to be detained and issue a civil detainer because of their criminal conduct, it is our obligation as a state, recognizing the supremacy of federal law, to detain that person. This body enacted a law that was in direct contradiction to that. I am attempting to amend our law to remove that mistake, for lack of a better term. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Stafford, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, not to belabor this, but the crux to this amendment, as I read it, and we've been debating it for some time now, really is at lines 31 through 35 of the amendment, which changes the basic premise of the Trust Act, which we've heard about and was passed back in 2013, that says, in current law in the state, that no law enforcement officer who receives a civil immigration detainer shall detain such individual unless, and then there's a number of enumerated circumstances which the good chairman of the Judiciary Committee went through. The amendment here, the language of it, reverses that. And it says any law enforcement officer who receives a civil immigration detainer shall detain such individual pursuant to such immigration detainer, period, and removes those circumstances under which a civil immigration detainer shall be complied with. My fear, Mr. Speaker, is that that language, and as we've heard today, I believe there's at least some concern as to what it means. But as I read that language, what it does is it says any civil immigration detainer shall be complied with, no matter what. So that begs the question, Mr. Speaker, what is a civil immigration detainer? And thankfully, the statute and the amendment contains a definition. At lines 6 through 7, it refers us back to the federal regulation that is promulgated by the department at the federal level. This is not a federal law. This is not a state law. It's a federal regulation. And the regulation, in fact, determines what an immigration detainer is and who can issue one. So through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if the proponent of the amendment is familiar with the federal regulation or not on which this amendment is predicated.
Thank you very much, Representative Sampson. That question's for you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have it before me, but I am familiar with it.
Thank you. Representative Staffstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, does the proponent of the amendment know who, in fact, can issue a civil immigration detainer? Does it have to be a federal judge, a federal prosecutor? Who can issue a civil immigration detainer? Through you.
Thank you. Representative Sampson, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of folks that can issue such a detainer: Border Patrol agents, special agents, immigration inspectors, people that are involved with Homeland Security. Again, federal law, not state law. Thank you, Mr.
Right. Through you, Mr. Speaker, I understand that comment, federal law, not state law, but what we're doing here in the state statute is incorporating a federal regulation into the statute and into this amendment. So through you, Mr. Speaker, is one of the people who can issue a civil immigration detainer a commercial airline pilot?
Thank you, Representative Staffstrom. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we are in the Connecticut House of Representatives. This is not the place to debate what the federal law is. The amendment is very simple. It says we recognize the supremacy of the federal government on immigration. We should remove the part that is in direct contradiction from our law because it is a deliberate attempt by state and local entities to impede the enforcement of that federal law. We are a nation of laws. We should follow them.
Thank you, Representative Sampson. Representative Staffstrom, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, although I'm not sure my question was directly answered, which was a fairly simple one of whether an airline pilot, commercial airline pilot, Delta, American Airlines, Southwest, JetBlue, can issue a civil immigration detainer or not. As I read that federal regulation, they can, in fact, do that. But, Mr. Speaker, more importantly, I would submit to you that, in fact, this body, this House of Representatives, is exactly where we should be debating this federal regulation. Because if this federal regulation, as the way I read it, and as I read it in connection with the amendment that is currently on the board before us, this amendment, if it passed, Mr. Speaker, would allow that JetBlue pilot, that Southwest airline pilot, to issue an immigration detainer requiring our Connecticut State Police, our corrections officers, and our local police to detain someone in custody. That is what this amendment would do, Mr. Speaker. And it would allow them to do that whether that person has been charged with a criminal violation or not. Does the proponent of the amendment have any language in this amendment or the federal regulation or other federal law that would put my mind at ease that that is not the ultimate effect of this amendment, through you?
Representative Sampson, please.
I do not, because I do not make federal law. I simply respect the oath of office I took to honor and uphold the Constitution of the United States, and I recognize that they have the constitutional authority to deal with immigration. I don't want us making policy on immigration. That's the point of the amendment, is to stop making policy on immigration. It's a very simple choice. Do we believe the federal government has the right to determine what our immigration policy is, or do we have the right as this body to ignore the federal government? If anyone in this room wants to change our federal immigration policy, I encourage them to run for Congress and attempt to do so. But we should not be doing it here.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Saffron, the floor is still yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, in fact, the proponent of the amendment cannot tell us whether this amendment would, in fact, allow a commercial airline pilot to order our state police to do something. You know, and I understand the point the proponent of the amendment is trying to make, and I don't disagree with it. If the federal government wants to allow a commercial airline pilot to order its federal agents around, its FBI agents, its customs and border enforcement agents around, that's the federal government's purview, and that is the purview of Congress. But when it comes to ordering around employees of the state of Connecticut or of the political subdivisions thereof, our cities and towns, that, sir, I believe through you, Mr. Speaker, is where we do properly exert our authority and enter in and decide whether and under what circumstances we want that commercial airline pilot to be able, or that border patrol agent, to be able to order around our state employees and our local and municipal employees. And we've settled that question in 2013, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through you on that point, do we have any idea of what the fiscal cost of adopting this amendment would be? Through you.
Thank you, sir. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. Between you and me, I don't necessarily agree with the fiscal analysis and the fiscal note that I've been provided with, because I would argue that it is incorrect as much as I'm sure my colleague would, but it says there is no fiscal impact. And if my colleague would like to discuss the cost of illegal immigration to our state budget and our national budget. I'm happy to get into that. I have a lot of information on it that I left out of my previous remarks, and I would relish questions on that to dispel the myth that somehow it is a benefit to have people in the country illegally. But again, the cost in dollars is far less than the cost in life and crime when you're dealing with people that are not just illegal aliens. Again, this bill applies to criminals, MS-13 gang members, Mr. Speaker. That's who it applies to. I think we should let the federal government do their job and get rid of these people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, thank you, Representative Sampson. Representative Staffstrom, you still have the floor, please. Do you have any further remarks or questions?
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I suspect that I do agree with the representative in the sense that the fiscal note for this probably is not accurate. Perhaps we disagree for different reasons. I think my concern for this is in a city like mine, of Bridgeport, that already has one of the highest mill rates in the state, already has several hundred police officers, but certainly could use several more, that they will be diverted from the streets of our city, diverted from doing traffic patrol, diverted from investigating other crimes, diverted from engaging in community policing in our public housing projects and in our shopping districts and in other parts of our city. And what they will instead be doing is following out orders of federal immigration agents, possibly even airline pilots, on when to hold someone against their will. Mr. Speaker, my other concern, and I know there are others who want to speak, so I will wrap this up. My other concern is for that person on the streets of a city like mine in Bridgeport who is the victim of a crime, who fears that they have been taken advantage of, but they may be in this country illegally. Under the Trust Act that we have now, that individual should feel confident to walk into the Bridgeport Police Department and to say they are the victim of the crime and that the police should investigate that crime with the same vigor and the same authority that they investigate any other crime that takes place in our city. Mr. Speaker, if this amendment is adopted, if this law goes through, that person living on that street who is the victim of that crime, who is living in this country illegally, should absolutely fear walking into that police station, because there is no guarantee that their name will not be run through a system, that some Border Patrol agent or some airline pilot issued a civil immigration detainer, and they are going to be held against their will and deported. So they are going to stay silent, Mr. Speaker. They're going to stay silent from that crime. The perpetrator of that crime is never going to be caught. This bill does not make us any safer. In fact, what it does, Mr. Speaker, is it makes us less lawless, and it allows justice to certain people over others. With that, Mr. Speaker, I firmly implore this chamber to reject this amendment, to recall that just several years ago we struck a balance in this chamber in employing the Trust Act and said our federal immigration agents should be able to go after criminals and those who are charged with crimes, but not those who are not. The proponent of this amendment could not give us assurance that this bill will not impact those who have not otherwise been charged with crimes, and I'll submit to you that it certainly does. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative. A moment if people would. I am not the only member of this body who has tinnitus. And when people raise their voices to make a point, it can be painful, and it's certainly not really necessary. We're hearing each other. So please, if people would remember to be respectful of each other, and not enough for that, don't be raising your voices. If there's trouble hearing people speaking normally with the microphones, come up to the dais and tell us. We'll have things adjusted. Thank you very much. Representative O'Day, now that I've taken the air out of the room, would you like to give us your mellifluous voice at a normal tone, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just a few questions to the proponent, if I may, and my good friend from Bridgeport, I think I agree with him. This amendment will make our cities less lawless, if I could quote him. I do believe, I think, through you, Mr. Speaker, question to the proponent of this amendment. As I understand it, this amendment is simply to address someone who's already detained. So we're not putting more obligations on officers who are already on the street. This person has already been detained. And what this amendment does is simply give the local authorities the option of whether or not to release them after 48 hours or not. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sampson, you said you were hoping for more questions. Congratulations. Here's one. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much to my colleague for asking that question to clarify the record, since it was claimed a moment ago that law enforcement would be out there engaging in federal immigration activity, and that is not the case. As was stated by my colleague, this bill would only make it so the federal law is followed and that people that are already being detained are treated according to federal law. No one is going out looking for anyone. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Representative. Representative O'Day, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I understand it, the civil detainer laws as contained in the federal regs are not changed at all by this amendment. Whatever the civil pilot can do now, they're going to be able to do if this amendment passes, and whatever they can't do now, they won't be able to do through this amendment if it passes. Through you, Mr. Speaker, is that correct?
Thank you very much, Representative O'Day. Representative Sampson, is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is also correct. We do not have the power to change federal law. Even the law that this amendment hopes to remove from our books doesn't really even work unless people choose to follow it, but they do so in direct contradiction to the supremacy of the federal government. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative. Representative O'Day again.
And to summarize, I think, and I do think there's an honest disagreement between what to do under these two scenarios. And I think this amendment attacks this issue. And this issue is that suppose someone who's under a civil detainer is arrested and they're sitting in a cell in New Canaan, my hometown. And under current law, if I understand it, we contact ICE as required, and ICE says whether they'll be here within 40 hours or they won't be here within 48 hours. And under the current law, through you, Mr. Speaker, my understanding is if ICE doesn't pick them up within 48 hours, New Canaan has to release. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson, to you, please.
Under the Trust Act and state law, that is correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative O'Day, please.
And if this amendment passes, what that will allow is New Canaan PD, if somebody's under civil detainer that they think should be held, and ICE says, listen, we can't be there within 48 hours, but we can be there within 50. Can you hold them for an extra 2 hours? Under this amendment, that would be allowed, but if this amendment doesn't pass, that wouldn't be allowed. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is also correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Representative. Representative O'Day, please.
And not to be simplistic, but I'm a simplistic man, as my good friend coming by me here in front row can attest to. Is there any real difference? Does this amendment really do anything else other than what I just kind of articulated? In other words, give the local PD the option to hold for a period of time longer than 48 hours, if necessary, to assist with the ICE request. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Representative. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And through you to my colleague, no, that's all the bill does. Through you, Mr. Speaker. The amendment, rather.
Great, thank you.
So to my friends on the other side of the aisle who disagree with this amendment, I don't want to get convoluted, but my understanding is we're simply addressing that one issue, and that one issue being if a local PD wants more time, if ICE wants more time than 48 hours in order to get that person, my understanding is that's the only issue that's addressed in this amendment. And so I would ask my colleagues, think about that, depending on where you live, In Bridgeport, I assume that's just a non-starter, but in my town, in New Canaan, that doesn't seem unreasonable, and I think it gives the local authorities the option. And the local authorities could release after 48 hours. They don't have to hold. So it just gives more choice to your local authorities. And so I would ask my colleagues to examine their districts and vote accordingly. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Representative O'Day. Will you remark further? Representative Damaso of the 116th. It's your turn, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is good to see you up there. Just a couple of general comments, maybe the 50,000-foot view on this. I really don't want to get into the immigration debate, but I've heard a lot of this argument as far as following the law, following federal law, following state law. You know, and certainly I want to be in compliance with all the laws we have, especially in the state of Connecticut. So keeping that in mind, do I really need to have the state police or my local police pull over a bicyclist for going over 65 miles an hour? Do I really need to have my probate clerk or my city clerk check to make sure they're not selling alcohol in the same place they're keeping official records? How about this? Do I need to have my health department or perhaps our consumer protection really check to make sure that every pickle we're selling in the state of Connecticut actually bounces? Because according to current law, if it doesn't bounce, it's not a pickle. How about this one? Do I really need to report my neighbor for throwing their used razor blades out in their regular trash pickup? You know, these are all things that, you know, if we're really going to have a conversation about numerous laws we may or may not be following, perhaps that's a larger conversation for a later date. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much for your comments, sir. Will you remark further on the amendment, Amendment B? Will you remark further? The Majority Leader, Representative Ritter, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the debate here, and it was good, I think, as the questioning went on that people asked their questions, and so we appreciate that process. I would say there's two comments I wanted to make. Number one, we all, when we take the oath of office in this chamber, for most of us, it was in January of 2017 for this term. For some, like Representative Gibson, it was only a few weeks ago. But we all take very, very seriously the oath that we take to this state and to this country. So to insinuate that a vote on an amendment in any way diminishes one's loyalty or affirmation of their oath to a Constitution is a road I'd rather not travel down in the future. We're all very proud of that, myself included. And I would just end by saying that last year in 2017, the federal government did threaten to withhold funding from states and cities that they felt violated their view of federal law. Connecticut was not on that list. So the current federal government and the current Attorney General, who I will get to in a second, said Connecticut, what their policies are, do not violate what is known as Section 1373 dealing with detainers because of our sharing of information, which I believe the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and the vice chairman dealt with. So we are compliant with this administration's view of their federal immigration policies based upon last year's stance. But I will say this to the fact that our state is compliant. If we are in any way an impediment, legally speaking, to some of the forces in Washington, D.C., I stand with that impediment. I'm proud to be part of that impediment. We're not violating anything. But are we an impediment at times to them? We might be, because our state has a different view of things. States' rights, that's our country. So if all we're doing today is arguing about whether we're an impediment to federal law and to some of the forces and voices we see down in the current federal Congress, I proudly stand as that impediment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ritter. Representative Cheeseman of the 37th, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have a couple of questions for the proponent of the bill. If he could, the amendment as it's stated, if he could prepare himself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Sampson, please. Prepare yourself. Representative Cheeseman, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Through you. It's my understanding, is it not, that that the Trust Act was devised in response to the Secure Communities program, which required local law enforcement once they'd arrested someone and it had been determined that they were subject to a federal warrant or detention, to then retain that person upon the arrival of ICE. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And through you to my delightful colleague, that is my understanding, yes, that certain legislatures across the country, including ours, created this state law purposely to obstruct the federal authorities on the subject of prosecuting people who are in violation of our immigration laws. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Representative Sampson. Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you. And through you, Mr. Speaker, so it's my understanding, and I just want to confirm it with the good proponent of the amendment, that under the Secure Communities Act, when an individual is arrested, taken into custody, it is customary for the local law enforcement to share their fingerprints with the FBI. Now, under the Secure Communities Act, they then share those fingerprints with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who are able to say, yes, this person is on our detainer list. Is my understanding correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam. Representative Sampson, to you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe you are correct. I don't work in law enforcement, but the process that you laid out seems like it is appropriate. I would note, however, that there is nothing in this that would say that someone could not, as an immigrant in the country, illegally approach law enforcement and tell them something. That doesn't generate a civil detainer. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Cheeseman, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, that's my understanding as well, that this only applies when an individual has been apprehended for some possible crime or other activity that local law enforcement deem to be illegal. And at that point, if their fingerprints, which are shared with the FBI and are shared with ICE, are determined to be in the system, then ICE is notified and could issue a detainer. Do we share the same understanding? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
To you, Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. And if I'm
to you, Representative
Thank you.
Cheeseman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And again, it's my belief that when ICE is notified, that they do in fact prioritize these detainers and removals, and they're looking particularly at people who present a most significant risk to public safety as determined by the severity of a crime, their criminal history, and other risks to public safety. Is that your understanding as well, Mr. Sampson? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Sampson, please.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, that is absolutely correct. In fact, I would note that in the days leading up to the 9/11 attack on our country, two of the hijackers had been stopped on separate occasions by the police department. And if their backgrounds and immigration status had been checked, that plot may have been uncovered. And the Trust Act being enacted essentially undoes that good work. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative Sampson. Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, it is not our Connecticut law enforcement or other police who are deciding on detainers. It's only federal immigration authorities who are making a decision with regard to detainers and the need for removal. Is that your understanding, Representative Sampson? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Again, Representative Sampson, the question is for you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, that is also completely accurate. The state has no jurisdiction to make that determination. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Cheeseman, do you have more, please?
Thank you. And I heard someone on the other side of the aisle state that commercial airline pilots could issue an immigration detainer. Was that your understanding of the law as it stands? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative Cheeseman. Representative Sampson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was stated before, I don't have that 287 federal regulation in front of me, but I do not believe that is accurate, no.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would just like to share with the good proponent of the amendment, having consulted the 287 and seen the line that says Border Patrol agents, including airline pilots, that includes those airline pilots who are actually Border Patrol agents. I have the good fortune to have a member of my family who works intimately with ICE and Department of Homeland Security, and he confirmed with me that commercial airline pilots, unless they are federal air marshals, are in fact unable to issue immigration detainers. So I just wanted to clear that point up. And I thank the good proponent of the amendment for his information. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam. Will you remark further on Amendment B? Will you remark further on Amendment B? Representative Ritter, I apologize for interrupting you before. Would you please remark further on Amendment B?
No problem. And I know we had a misunderstanding. Some people were previously on the board, so no problem on my end. I would just urge everyone in the chamber to vote against the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Majority Leader. If there is no further comments, will staff and guests please come to the well of the House? Will the members please take your seats and the machine will be opened.
The House of Representatives is voting by roll. Members to the chamber. The House of Representatives is voting by roll. Members to the chamber.
Have all members voted? Have all members voted? Will the members please check the board to determine if your vote is properly cast? If all members have voted, the machine will be locked and the clerk will take a tally. The clerk will please announce the tally.
House B, total number voting 147, necessary for adoption 74, those voting yea 62, those voting nay 85, absent not voting 3.
The amendment fails. Returning to the bill. Will you remark further on the bill as amended? Will you remark further on the bill as amended? Will you remark further on the bill as amended? If not, will staff and guests please come to the well of the House? Will the members please take your seats and the machine will be opened.
The House of Representatives is voting by roll. Members to the chamber. The House of Representatives is voting by roll. Members to the chamber.
Have all members voted? Have all members voted? Will the members please check the board to determine if your vote is properly cast? If all members have voted, the machine will be locked and the clerk will take a tally. Thank you very much. The clerk will please announce the tally.
House Bill 5185 as amended by House A, total number voting 147, necessary for passage 74. Those voting yea 143, those voting nay 4, absent not voting 3.
The bill as amended is passed.